Been waiting a little while, so we're going to make this quick. We're going to have a fireside chat, but first I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Joe Auender. He's my chiropractor, and he is one of the hosts of this evening. So come on out here. There he is. Yay. I'd also like to introduce you to our other host and the moderator of our fireside chat, Dr. Oberstein, who's the president of Life Chiropractic College West. Come on out here, Dr. Oberstein.
Well, welcome to Life Chiropractic College West, and we are very excited to have Team Kennedy with us today, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with us today. We're also thrilled to welcome all of you to be with us. As an educational institution, we're excited to be able to, that Team Kennedy reached out to us to ask us to be, if they could hold this event with us. My team at the college, Dr. Peter Kevorkian, and his team at Institutional Advancement have done just a wonderful job working with Team Kennedy to make today happen. We're especially grateful to Team Kennedy's legal department, who was working hand in hand with Life Chiropractic College West legal team, Mr. Joel Siegel, to arrange this event and keep everything in accordance with our 501c3 status. In addition, our events coordinator, Beth Mitchell, that she has ever worked with. We're talking about from setup all the way through to catering. There are many important issues that candidates will, that all the candidates will be addressing. And as chiropractors, we have strong convictions about personal health and societal well-being, and we are looking forward to hearing Mr. Kennedy's views and topics that are important to our society. While the college cannot endorse candidates, what we can do is encourage everyone to become fully aware of all the issues and ways to solve them to create opportunities for health, healing, and a better future. As the election moves forward, I want to make it public knowledge that Life Chiropractic College West will be happy to host any presidential debates in the Bay Area. And other events that will move more civic discourse forward. As we move into a fireside chat format this afternoon, we as chiropractors look at all matters organically and holistically. We view looking at these issues today, the societal issues, the same way. Many people talk about the symptoms that are pervasive and readily observable, whether it be societal health, our environment, or our right to free speech. And though these symptoms alone are each vitally important, understanding the root nature of their cause is imperative. That's what we do as chiropractors. We hope that our leaders also look at the world and its issues holistically, and today we hope to touch on some of these important topics. Today, we will touch on some symptoms or the issues, but also we'll look at some of the causes. The upcoming November election may very well be the most important election many of us will participate with in our lifetime. I'd like to turn it back over to Alex Meyer, and she's going to introduce our guest today.
Dr. Oberstein, let's give him a big round of applause. Okay, I'm going to make some remarks before we bring out the candidate. I am such a huge fan of chiropractors. I was vaccine injured and disabled in the 1990s, and chiropractors have been one of the key professions to help me with my recovery. So thank you to the chiropractors of Life Chiropractic College West. I think we're watching the most incredible presidential campaign in a very long time. I'm sure you all would agree. There hasn't been an independent candidate in the White House since George Washington. A recent Gallup poll shows Biden and Trump only have 40% favorability ratings. Our candidate has 52%. And not only that, he commands 20% of the vote already, and he's gaining 2% per month. And by November, he's going to have enough support to take the White House. And our candidate, he never stated he wanted to be a public servant in his life, but I think he was born a public servant. He sees it as his duty to lead us and serve us at a time when few U.S. elected officials recall that they serve the people, not the other way around. I had the incredible opportunity to serve with our candidate on the board at Children's Health Defense for 4 years. I had a front and center seat to watch him make decisions, strategic decisions, decisions that had huge consequences with eloquence and grace and intelligence. And you're really talking about a Renaissance man. He weaves together history, politics, science, medicine, philosophy, and literature, and everything. He is a Renaissance man. You don't hear anybody talk like this anymore about the issues, but you do when you listen to our candidate. He's got an unusual path to the White House, and I know everybody here is invested in making sure he gets there. To get on the ballot, our candidate has to gather enough signatures in each state to form a new party. The party is called We the People. Who knows why it's called We the People? The Constitution. Those are the first 3 words of our Constitution. Because what he noticed when we were locked down is that our Bill of Rights, you know, that thing that preserves free speech and allows us to gather in public, that was trampled during lockdowns. That shouldn't have been the case. The Constitution, as he's said many times, was written for times of emergency. It is never to be subservient to an emergency. So our new party is We the People. And I have fantastic news about the We the People party. He easily got enough signatures to qualify for the ballot in New Hampshire and Utah. Easily. And now he needs 70,000 Californians to do the same thing in California. Can we do that? How many people have already done that? Oh my goodness. Okay, everybody, there's a QR code on your way out. Get a button, use your phone, take the QR code, show it to other people. I want everybody here to get 10 other people to register for the We the People party at Kennedy24.com. Can you do that? Okay, awesome. So, just give me a second. Okay, if anybody knows what We the People want, it's an intelligent president who can unify our country and ensure that our constitutional rights are protected. It's a president who knew what was wrong with the COVID narrative and who took action to uncover the truth by doing research, taking legal action, and writing incredible books like The Real Anthony Fauci and The Wuhan Cover-Up. Who's read those books? Most of us. That's incredible. It's a president who knows what's really going on at the border and wants to stop illegal immigration. It's a president who will fix the epidemic of chronic illness in this country that plagues more than half of our children. It's a president who got a PhD, or the equivalent of a PhD, in how to fix the corruption in our 3-letter agencies, starting with the CIA, the NIH, the CDC, and the FDA. And he can do it. It's a president who wants to stop the endless wars in other countries and endless wars on so-called terror. It's a president who will not let us become subservient to the WHO's plans or to the CBDC that will make us all government digital slaves with social credit scores. He is our man. He's going to stop that. And he's going to do more. Our president is the one who wants to heal all the manufactured divides over race, over war, and over medicine. Someone committed to unifying our country when others would destroy it. Okay. Who knows who I'm talking about? Okay, everybody give it up really loudly for the next President of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Thank you. Very sweet. Thank you. thank you for helping us all protect ourselves. By the way, I just won a case in the Federal Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. against FCC, in which I sued FCC because they had been lying to the public about the dangers of cell phone radiation. And you know, that's another of my conspiracy theories. But the Court of Appeal, the Federal Court of Appeals, a panel, full panel of the Federal Court of Appeals agreed with me and ordered FCC to go back and start the regulatory process on cell phones. And they're literally we cited over 10,000 studies in our brief showing that cell phone radiation makes the blood-brain barrier pervious so that toxins can enter the brain very, very easily. There's many studies out there that indicate they cause tumors and a lot of other behavioral problems, depression, a lot of other really terrible injuries. And we allow cell phone radiation in this country that is not allowed in Europe and Russia, which knows more about cell phone radiation. Many of the best studies come out of Russia. And they've now banned cell phones in their schools, which we should be doing too. Oh.
Great. Great. So our format today is going to be a fireside chat, but we're also going to be having questions and answers, or questions from the audience. So at the end, we'll have questions from the audience, we'll have microphones, and you'll be able to ask Mr. Kennedy your own questions if we don't cover everything that you'd like to hear, okay? Mr. Kennedy, thank you. Thank you for the time that you're giving, and thank you for giving the educational attitude that this country needs. So we really appreciate it, and I've got some questions that I'd like to ask you today, and we can have a conversation about it, or you can just talk and do whatever you'd like to do. First question, and these have come from a lot of different areas, is about chronic diseases. Chronic diseases is at an all-time high. And how do you plan as president to address this crisis?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you for having me here. I'm very, very happy to be here with all the chiropractors. Chiropractors have been kind of the front line in this movement from the beginning. And when I was running Children's Health Defense, and when I launched Children's Health Defense, our biggest core of supporter was coming from chiropractors because they are really the front lines of healing medicine in this country. And they have the entire profession has kind of a very, very healthy level of skepticism against official orthodoxies. And part of the reason for that are the attacks that have been launched on this profession by the American Medical Association and by all of allopathic medicine since the days of the Rockefeller Commission and John D. Rockefeller's efforts to root out alternative and functional and integrative medicine and alternatives that were not, essentially dependent on petroleum-based pharmaceutical companies or products. And the chiropractors have been have been at the end of those attacks, have been the target of those attacks. Anybody who decides to go into this brand of medicine immediately finds out that, number one, that there are actually a lot of healing going on. If you ask me when the last time I saw a chiropractor is, I'd say it was yesterday. And and the last time before that was the day before. So, I've seen it firsthand, and I also I'm so grateful for the support that we've received. First of all, for Children's Health Defense from this profession, and then my campaign, and a lot of my electors around the country are chiropractors, and we've been very, our campaign is very intertwined with the chiropractic community. In answer to the question about chronic disease, on the way over here, I watched a clip that Tucker Carlson just posted on his Twitter feed. So I think it's the second one down from the top of his Twitter feed, and I urge you all to look at it. And it's a clip, it's an interview that he did with a former pharmaceutical company executive about Ozempic. And it's really revealing. It's an extraordinary piece of television, and it's a really wonderful expose on this product. One of the things that he said is it's a product that is illegal for weight loss in Europe. It's made by the biggest pharmaceutical company in Europe, Novo Nordisk. And they say in their materials, we're going to get all of this money from, this is going to be the biggest medical product ever made. And 100% of the money is going to come from the United States of America, because we have the greatest obesity issue in the world. We have the greatest diabetes affliction, and we're the only ones that will allow it. And the impacts of this drug are just terrible. It paralyzes the stomach. It stops a lot of the serotonin that we produce happens in the stomach, part of the microbiome, and it destroys our capacity to produce serotonin. And it has on its label now, I think, black box warnings about suicidal ideation, and that and then it works while you use it for a lot of people, but it causes severe gastrointestinal problems. And the moment you stop using it, you regain all the weight. And meanwhile, your stomach's been paralyzed, and a lot of those impacts last, apparently, according to what they said on the program, after the use of the drug is terminated. But some of the most interesting, he talks about the amount of lobbying money that is going into the AAP, that the NAACP is now a registered lobbyist for the pharmaceutical companies, and on their website they label criticism of Ozempic as racist. And the amount of money that's going into into the medical associations that are supposed to be, that pretend to be protecting our health, and to Congress and to the press and all of these, they basically undermined all the institutions of our democracy to make us the sickest country in the history of the world and the sickest generation in American history. And one of the data points that he talks about is that, about 30 to 35% of children are now diabetic or pre-diabetic. And he talks about the fact that when, 20 years ago, a pediatrician, it would be typical for a pediatrician to run across one case of a child with diabetes in their lifetime, their entire career. And now 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through their door has diabetes, and nobody's asking why this is happening. And 50%, according to official data, he says it's actually 60% of adults are now diabetic or pre-diabetic. And 42% of children are obese, 75% of them are overweight, half of adults are obese, and Americans didn't suddenly get lazy. We're being mass poisoned. And we're being mass poisoned by a food industry that is highly subsidized and that owns Congress. We're the only country in the world that allows public funding for food to go to soft drinks. Oh, it's 10% of food stamps are going to sugar water that is designed to make you diabetic. You know, and it's $10 billion a year that we're spending to make our kids diabetic. And you know, this is happening across the spectrum. It's not just diabetes. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. And by chronic disease, I mean the whole universe that encompasses obesity, autoimmune diseases like juvenile diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and then all of these exotic diseases that, you know, I never heard of as a kid. Crohn's disease, lupus, you guys know there's 175 of them. It's because your body has turned, you know, your metabolic process is ruined, your mitochondria are ruined, and your body's immune system turns against its own organs. And that is autoimmune disease, but each one of those autoimmune diseases, you know, has a different name depending on what organ it attacks. And what part of your body it now regards as a foreign invader. And I represent, you know, people who've been injured by medical products and whose lives are ruined. And that's particularly tragic when it's the vaccines that are doing it, because these were healthy kids. These were not sick kids giving a medicine that has a risk to make them better. There are people who had zero risk, zero. And now they're sick for life, and they're dependent now on new medicines, you know, on these medicines that are coming out. And how are those medicines developed? They're developed, most of them are developed by NIH, which collects royalties on them, and then spun off to the pharmaceutical industry. And then they are, you know, and they're developed to treat the chronic disease that they're causing. Oh, we now spend $4.3 trillion on health care, and 93% of the Medicare bills are going to treat chronic disease. These are gravy trains for pharma. Because it's a lifetime. You want to treat, if you have to treat measles, what's the treatment? It's chicken soup and vitamin A, and you can't patent either of them. But if one out of every 300 kids gets seizures, and one out of every 1,000 of those gets lifetime epilepsy, now you have lifetime clients for very, very expensive drugs. And you know, and we saw this explosion of chronic disease that happened in 1989. When my uncle was president, 4% of our GDP went to healthcare. Today it's 20% and growing. And we spend more than any other country, $4.3 trillion. Our military expenditures, if you include veterans benefit, national security, and foreign aid, that amounts to about $1.3 trillion a year. Our healthcare costs are $4.3 trillion. So it's by far, it's the thing that's bankrupting us. And you know, all the proposals by Democrats and Republicans to regulate health care, which they fight about everything, whether it's Obamacare or single payer or public-private option or all the different iterations, they're all just moving around deck chairs on the Titanic. It's all about deciding who's going to pay for the mess, right? Rather than saying, how are we going to stop the ship from sinking? And as president, I'm going to end the chronic disease epidemic. And you know, that might sound wildly ambitious, but it isn't. It can be done, and it can be done pretty easily. And I'll tell you how. when I was a kid, I lived 15 minutes from Bethesda, Maryland. And I had there was a woman who worked for my mom who was married to a scientist who worked at NIH, and I used to go down to NIH all the time because I wanted to be a scientist when I grew up, and I loved going in there and talking to the scientists and looking through the microscopes and seeing the mice and the rats but at that time, NIH was the premier gold standard scientific agency in the world. And it was doing real science and finding cures to diseases and finding out what was making us sick. But then in 1980, the Congress passed an act called the Bayh-Dole Act that allowed NIH to pocket 50% of the royalties from drugs that it helped develop. And it allowed NIH scientists who'd worked on those drugs to also collect royalties. So you have this bizarre situation, which is pretty unique in this country, where people who are being paid from taxpayer money are developing products upon which they can collect a lot of money and get rich. And NIH itself, just to take one product, the Moderna vaccine, which was heavily promoted by the federal agencies, NIH owns 50% of that product. So 50% of the royalties are coming back to NIH. And not only that, but there are 6 individuals who work at NIH, high-level people, who have margin rights for the patents. So they can pocket $150,000 a year forever. As long as an mRNA product is on the marketplace, they can make money from it, personal money. So they're paying for their mortgages and their children's education and their boats and their cars and their alimony by promoting this product. And that conflict of interest and the mercantile aspirations of that company and these individuals is clearly going to undermine the regulatory function of that agency. And, that's what it's done. When I was a boy, NIH and FDA were revered around the world for doing real science and being agencies of utter integrity. There are, like a lot of these, there's 122 nations created after World War II. A lot of them on the African and Asian continent, and they didn't have the money to create their own health agencies. So they have in their constitutions, if FDA approved it, then it's approved in our country. So they all were looking to us for good science. And the Bayh-Dole Act undermined that. And now I think it was 2016, and I have to look this up, so don't rely on this data point, but I know, and this is in the Fauci book, I think there was one year, maybe it was 2016, where there were 220 new drugs approved by FDA, and all of them came out of NIH. And so it is now become an incubator for pharmaceutical products. And it's not doing the science that we want done. Why is gun violence suddenly increased? Why do these mass shootings suddenly appear in this country, not anywhere else? There's a number of things it could be. I've suggested that SSRIs may have something to do with it. There was indications of that during their clinical trials. They have a black box warning on those products that say a suicidal and a homicidal ideation and behavior and benzos, but it could be other things. It could be video games. Something happened, though, in this country that didn't happen anywhere else in the world, where people started picking up guns and killing children. It's never happened before in human history. When I was a kid, there were gun clubs in our schools. Kids came to school with their .22s for rifle practice. Oh, nobody started shooting children. It was unimaginable. And yet, it's happening here. And there's other nations that have comparable numbers of guns, like Switzerland, where the last mass shooting in Switzerland was 21 years ago. We have one every 21 hours. So something happened, and and NIH ought to be asking that question because it's a public health threat. But since 1997, they have not done one study, and they have a policy not to study the etiology of gun violence. They won't study the etiology of any of these diseases because they know at the end of that is an answer that is going to harm the commercial ambitions of a big company. And but what I'm going to do when I get in there is I'm going to go to Bethesda my first week, and I'm going to say we're going to give infectious disease and drug development a break for about 8 years. And that doesn't mean all drug development, but we're going to really scrutinize any proposals, and we're going to focus on why are our kids the sickest kids in the world? Why did we have the highest COVID death rate on the planet? We had 16% of the COVID deaths. We only have 4.2% of the globe's population. Why isn't anybody asking that question? Why are people getting awards for management of the epidemic when we have the worst track record of any nation in the world? So, CDC says, oh, it wasn't our fault. It was because we have the highest chronic disease rate. The average American who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. Oh, they had diabetes, they had obesity, they had asthma, and one other thing. But CDC is not asking the obvious next question: why? Why did black people in our country have a death rate of 3,000 per million population, and black people in Haiti, which they said was going to be wiped out by COVID, and Nigeria have a death rates of 14 per million population, 1/200th of ours? Why isn't anybody asking that question? Congress did ask that one question, pertinent question of EPA. What year did the autism epidemic begin? In my generation, 1 in 10,000 70-year-old American men has full-blown autism, by which I mean nonverbal, non-toilet trained, stimming, head banging, toe walking, hand flapping. 1 in 10,000, my generation looked like that. And 1 in every 34 kids my kids' generation do. Congress said, what year did it begin? And EPA, they asked EPA, not CDC. EPA is a captive agency, but it's captured by big oil and big coal and big chemical, not by pharma, because pharma, it doesn't regulate pharma. So they came back with an honest answer, and the answer was 1989. So something happened, and you look back, a lot of these illnesses began around that same timeline. Suddenly, food allergies, peanut allergies. If you're my age, you never saw a peanut allergy. I have 11 siblings, something like 70 first cousins. I didn't know anybody with a peanut allergy. Why do 5 of my 7 kids have food allergies? Why isn't anybody answering that question? Why are there EpiPens in every classroom in America? Why are there albuterol inhalers in every classroom in America? And seizure medication. What is going on? And why are we pretending that this is not happening? And it is the biggest thing that's happening. It's bigger than all the wars and intrusions and the AI. It's the biggest thing. And the other presidential candidates aren't talking about it either. It's just sailing along like it's the biggest thing. These kids are all damaged, and we got a generation of damaged kids, and they know it. They come up to me every time I have a line, and they say, these kids come one at a time saying, I have autoimmune disease. Thank you for talking about it. I have POTS. I have rheumatoid arthritis. My brother has autism. My son has autism. Thank you for talking about it. And, you can say to me, and then all the neurological diseases began around the same time: ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette's syndrome, ASD, autism. We have an entire generation of kids who's on Adderall, 120 million prescriptions a year. 120 million prescriptions of SSRIs, 120 million prescriptions of benzos. And nobody's saying, kids don't need drugs. If they're, in my generation, we didn't need all these drugs. And it's not because doctors are overprescribing everything. That's what people blame it on. These kids are damaged. I see kids all the time who cannot sit and read a book. They cannot, unless they have Adderall. And, and then you don't give them Adderall, and their self-esteem and all these other issues are going to plummet, but it's not. So it's not the doctor's fault they're writing Adderall prescriptions. So why aren't we answering the big question? Why is it happening? You could have an entire collapse of our economy, and that could happen. We could go to war. Terrible things could happen to this country, but we'll figure it out. We have what Franklin Roosevelt called America's industrial genius. We can deal with it. We're strong. We have resilience in our country. We have this, an entrepreneurial resourcefulness and problem solving. We're good at all those things. And you can do it, but if that happens and you have a sick kid, or if you have it's soul crushing. It will rob us of our resilience as a nation. And this isn't just a handful of kids. It's the majority of them. It's, with 50% of adults and headed up to 50% of children have juvenile diabetes. And most of them, that's not the only thing they got. We need some, and what I'll do is you can say to me, okay, there's certain culprits. We know it's an environmental exposure. It has to be. Genes don't cause epidemics. It's caused by an environmental toxin. Phil Landrigan, who's probably the most famous toxicologist in this country, has looked at this issue and said that timeline, there's only a certain number of things that fit it. PFOAs, forever chemicals, flame retardants, that were put into all of our kids' pajamas and our furniture, at that timeline. Glyphosate, which was put in Roundup, which became ubiquitous around that timeline. Atrazine, which is now in almost all of our water supply. Neonicotinoid pesticides. High fructose corn syrup introduced on that timeline. Cell phone radiation. There's about 13, 15 things it could be. It's pretty easy to design a study to figure out what the culprit is. And it's probably not one. On the vaccine schedule, which went from 3 vaccines when I was a kid to 72 vaccines that my kids got. And incidentally, the manufacturer's inserts of those products list every one of those diseases as a side effect. So that has to be considered among all of these culprits, and it's probably a collaboration of some or all of them. Many of them, operate along the same biological pathways. We can figure it out, and then we can eliminate them. And you can say, well, Bobby, even if you identified beyond a reasonable doubt that it was high fructose corn syrup that's causing the diabetes and obesity epidemic, and it was the sole cause, you still couldn't get rid of it because the industry's so powerful. The ag industry, the food processing, they own Congress. They own the regulatory agencies, and they own the press. You'll never get rid of it. But here's what you do. If NIH is functioning, it will happen on its own. We'll do the science. And then the attorneys come in. So if you give them the science, this is what happened with glyphosate. There's a threshold in the federal law and a similar one in the state courts called the Daubert threshold. And what Daubert says, the Daubert case said that a judge cannot give a case to a jury until there is sufficient scientific evidence to support a link between a certain exposure and a certain illness. So if I had a client who came into me and said, I drank 6 Cokes a day and they caused me cancer, gut cancer, I would say that case is no good, because you have to come in with 20 studies, rat studies, guinea pig studies, bench studies, observational studies, epidemiological studies, a whole range of different kinds of studies that say drinking 8 Cokes a day can cause you colon cancer. Otherwise, the judge is not even allowed to let you make that argument to a jury. So what the way that NIH has protected the industry is to make sure those studies never happen. And they happened with glyphosate. They hit that critical mass of studies that a judge made a determination this can go over the Daubert threshold. There was maybe 15 or 20 studies of that, all those different kinds of studies that all said, yeah, the exposure to this project causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So we were able to, exposure to glyphosate caused a lot of other things too. Lots and lots of other things. Probably the celiac allergies, the glutathione, non-alcoholic fatty liver cancer, many, many other things. And there are studies that show that, but not enough to sue. So, but with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, there was enough. So we sued. Well, what I'm going to do as president is I'm going to make sure that for every exposure, there are sufficient studies out there to exceed the Daubert. And all these kids who are obese, have diabetes, now have claims that they can go to that industry and say, and then we get discovery and we see what they knew, and we figure out that they knew, as we always figure out, they knew. It shows in their emails, it shows in their letters to each other, their private correspondence, their text messages, what I'm going to get. And then they'll, say, oh yeah, we better not let this study happen because it's going to confirm what we know, which is, high fructose corn syrup causes diabetes. And that, that's how we fix the problem.
Mr. Kennedy, our country is probably at an all-time high right now of divisiveness. How will you heal the divide as President of the United States?
Yeah, it's a good question. How do you heal the divide? And what I said when I declared my candidacy almost 9 months ago in Boston is that we are suffering an era of polarization, probably greater than at any time since the American Civil War. It's toxic, and it's amplified by social media algorithms that feed on confirming, on confirmation bias, on telling people what they want to hear, what they already believe, and giving them confirmation of that, which increases the polarization. And so how do you get through that? And what I said is I'm going to do 2 things. One is I'm not going to feed into the rancor. I'm going to identify the issues that Americans have in common, the values that we have in common, rather than focusing on the culture war issues that are used to keep us all at each other's throats. And then the other thing I'm going to do is to tell the truth to people. And, no matter what the cost, no matter, without a political calculation, just to tell people what the truth is. And that's why I feel comfortable going on these long form interviews, which other politicians won't do, because I don't have anything. I'm going to just tell the truth. And I don't have to make political calculations and judgments and polls before I talk, because I know, I only have one thing I'm going to say. And I said in Boston, if there's an appetite for the truth in this country, then I'll be president in 2025. And if there isn't, then I'll just go back to doing what I was doing and be very content and peaceful about it. But my father had the same plan. My father, when he ran for president in 1968, it was at a time that was almost as divisive as now. You could argue it was more divisive. There were rioting every summer from 1966, 67, 68. When my father ran, there 2 months before, Martin Luther King had been killed, and there were riots, I think, in 127 cities. Many of them were burned to the ground. Large parts of the city where I was then was burned. Southeast Washington was burned to the ground, Detroit, many other cities. There were soldiers who were shooting our children on America's college campuses. There were riots between construction workers and hippies and peaceniks. It was really, there was bad division in our country. There were buildings being blown up, whether underground, government buildings, city buildings in New York, brown houses in New York, buildings on the college campuses. Colleges were being occupied by students. So there was a lot going on that we forget about. My father ran then, and he ran at a time when there was really no chance of him winning. He was running against a popular president of his own party. And he had everybody against him. He had all the liberal press, from the New York Times, the Village Voice, which had been with him in 1960 when he ran his brother's campaign, John Kennedy's campaign. The unions were all against him, and they'd been with him. The only unions that supported my father in '68 were the United Auto Workers and Cesar Chavez Union, United Farm Workers. Everyone else was against him, the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters, everybody. The big city mayors, which have all been with him in 1960, mainly Catholic mayors, were all against him, including Mayor Daley in Chicago, where the convention was going to be. And the people who had been with him his closest friends, who had been part of the New Frontier and Camelot, almost all of them were working for the Johnson White House. So they were against him. And so he ran without any hope of winning, but he ran because he felt he could not support the war. And he couldn't support Johnson, and he didn't want to be sniping at him from the sideline. He just, to be true to himself, he had to do it. And he just told the truth to people. He told, when he went on the college campus, he lost the college students at the beginning because Gene McCarthy was saying, yeah, I'm going to protect your deferments. And my father said, it's not fair. There's 45% of every paratrooper group in Vietnam is black, and they shouldn't be fighting the war. It's not fair that you can buy your way out of the war by, going to college. He said he used to say that he had all the C students, and then McCarthy had the A and B students. But he told them that. He went to the medical school at University of Nebraska, and they said, who's going to pay for your health care program? And he said, you are. He gave a lecture to blacks and Watts about obeying the law and how important that was. And he gave a lecture to students at the University of Alabama, which he had forcefully integrated 5 years earlier with 20,000 troops. He gave them a lecture on civil rights. And, and people, as it turned out, wanted to hear that. And the last day of his life, he won the most rural state in our country, which was South Dakota, and the most urban state, which was California. And, when I took him on his last train ride I was with him when he died in LA, and then I was 14 years old and went on that train ride from Union State or Penn Station in New York to Union Station in Washington. There were 2.5 million people on the tracks, and they were every color of the rainbow. They were the entire American experience. The priests, rabbis, nuns in Newark and Baltimore and Philadelphia and all the cities on the route. Wilmington, there were thousands of blacks singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. We were going 1 mile an hour the whole way. And, he had succeeded in bringing together poor working whites and poor urban blacks, rural blacks, American Indians, all of the disenfranchised people in our country, and uniting our country. And, so it is possible. And, my plan is to do the same thing.
We're going to come back to some of my questions, but we want to take a few questions from the audience. So we have a mic right over here. Perfect.
Hi, Robert Kennedy. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. I was in Ukraine in 2022 during the war. So I was there when the Crimea bridge got hit. And and then 2 days after that, we had 150 rockets go into Ukraine. So I was there to see all of Lviv shut down, because I was in a 10-story building. So I feel I'm here for the Ukrainian people. I really want you to win. I have my own theories about this war. I think America played a big role in starting it. My military friends are saying that the CIA was involved in Maidan Square. So I'm one of the few Ukrainians that doesn't trust Zelensky. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the war and how do you plan to end it?
On the Ukraine war?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to end the Ukraine war the first week I'm in office. Because you're right. The CIA played a big role in the war. We have a long history with that war, of the build-up to that war. In 1992, when the Soviets dismantled their empire, and Gorbachev allowed us to reunite Germany, East and West Germany, under NATO, which was a hostile army to the Soviets. And they moved out 450,000 of their troops and let us move our troops into their barracks. And the one promise that Gorbachev asked for at that time was that after that, we would never move NATO to the East. He was going to give freedom to all these Soviet satellite countries, allow them to including Ukraine. And he didn't want a foreign army on his doorsteps. And James Baker famously, who was then Secretary of State, famously said to him, "We will not move NATO 1 inch to the east." And then 5 years later, Zbigniew Brzezinski and the neocons, who had started infiltrating our foreign policy apparatus, announced plans to move NATO into every country around the Soviet Union and to form a noose around it. And at that time, George Kennan, the most important diplomat in American history, the author of the containment policy, said, if you do that, it is insane. You're going to force Russia into a violent response because they cannot tolerate these armies at their doorstep any more than we would tolerate a Soviet army in Cuba or Mexico. They can't do it. They've been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time they were invaded, Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. They will never be able to tolerate that. And yet the temptation to do it is so great because the people who own Congress are Raytheon, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing. And when you sign a new country up for NATO, the first thing they have to do is to conform their weapons purchases to NATO specifications. So they have to buy from our companies. And so Congress is under big pressure to continually expand NATO. And that's what this war was about. And in 2014, the CIA, and by the way, Bill Perry, who was then the U.S. ambassador, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, said, I'm going to resign if you do this because you are doing something. We should be supporting Russia and helping them rebuild like we did with the Marshall Plan in Europe, not treating them like they're an enemy, or you're going to make them an enemy. It's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Bill Pierce, who is now the head of the CIA, was then the Soviet U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, said the same thing. So our most important diplomats said, don't do it, you can't do it. What do? We moved 1,000 miles to the east into 14 countries. And then we walked away from our 2 nuclear weapons, intermediate missile treaties with the Soviets, and we put nuclear-ready missile systems in Romania and Poland. 12 minutes from Moscow, we could decapitate the entire Kremlin leadership in 12 minutes. Would we tolerate that if the Russians did it to us? Never. I know that because I watched when they did it in '62. And my father disappeared for 13 days when we came within moments of full-scale nuclear exchange because we weren't going to stand for it. And my uncle in the end agreed, made a secret deal with the Russians because Khrushchev had moved them into Cuba because we had put nuclear missile systems in Turkey, the Jupiter systems. My uncle defused the whole thing by secretly agreeing with Russia, with Khrushchev, to pull our missiles out of Turkey if he would pull them out of Cuba. And now we're moving them back. So of course they're not going to tolerate it. And then in 2014, Ukraine had a government that was neutral. It wanted to stay neutral between East and West. So we overthrew them. It was an elected government. We spent $5 billion organizing a coup called the Maidan Rebellion. We put our government in. It was handpicked by Victoria Nuland at the State Department. We now have the taped conversations where she picks the cabinet a month before the revolution. And we put our government in, and of course, Russia says, now the U.S. is running Ukraine, and they're going to put the United States Navy in our port for 347 years in Sebastopol. And so they go into Crimea. They don't kill a single person. The Crimeans want them in because the new U.S. in place government has been killing ethnic Russians, 14,000 ethnic Russians it killed. It banned the Russian language. It treated Russians, who are half the population of Ukraine, as second-class citizens. And Putin at that point says, we got to have a peace treaty. I don't want to come in. The people of Donbass and Lugansk voted to join Russia 9-1. And Putin said, I don't want to go in. I don't want you. But let's sign a treaty that makes you agree to keep NATO out. And he proposed the Minsk Accords. It was negotiated by France, by Germany, by England. Everybody approved it. And then Zelensky ran in 2019, a comedian, an actor, no political experience, but he wins with 70% of the vote, promising peace, and he's going to sign the Minsk Accords. And he gets in and he pivots because we made him pivot. We wouldn't let him sign the peace agreement. And then Russia, when we walked away from it, sends 40,000 troops into Donbass and Lugansk. And we say, oh, they're trying to conquer Europe. Really? With 40,000 troops? This is a nation of 44 million people. Did he really want to conquer it? And he said at that time, I don't want to conquer it. I want you back at the peace table. We wouldn't help Zelensky, so Zelensky goes to Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Erdogan in Turkey, and says, the United States won't help me. Will you help me negotiate a peace agreement? And they negotiate one, and they sign it, and Putin begins withdrawing the troops. And President Biden sends Boris Johnson over there and forces Zelensky to tear up that agreement. And how do we know that? Because all the negotiators have now talked publicly about it, including Naftali Bennett. And you can go on YouTube and you can listen to their talks. And after that, we've sent 450,000 Ukrainian kids have died, not for freedom in Ukraine, but to promote these U.S. geopolitical interests and Russian. And I'm not excusing Putin. Putin should never have gone in. He had other choices. But we need to understand, our role also in provoking the war, and not just have this comic book description that we're fed by the mainstream media, which is all owned by Blackstone or BlackRock, and guess who else is owned by BlackRock? Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed, General Dynamics, all of them. They're all owned by BlackRock, and BlackRock has the contract not only to destroy the Ukraine, but also the $500 billion contract to rebuild it. Oh, and to get all the land. It's so corrupt, and we don't belong there.
Wow. Question from this.
Thank you. Bob, I got a question. You eloquently spoke about the chronic illnesses in America. It seems like we, the voters, have some kind of chronic issue. Without naming names, we elect people like George Santos and AOC and Rashida Tlaib, and they get in there. And Washington is infested, and you're going to have to work with people. There's only so many executive orders. What do you say about that? How can we fix that?
Fix what?
How we vote for people and the information that we're being fed. I realize that the algorithms tell us what we want to hear, but when you look at some of the cast of characters over there, they don't deserve to be in Congress. But we're electing them, and then they're there, and they're wreaking havoc. It just seems like when your uncle was there, things were different. There were two sides of the aisle, but they were civil. And right now there is no civility. Everybody's looking for their 5 minutes of fame every day. What can we do about it?
Well, I don't know. I think people should be able to vote for who they want to vote for, and those individuals that you named are liberals. Well, I don't know what Santos was. I don't even know what his ideology was. Other than crazy. But AOC has her constituents. I don't agree with her on almost anything. But her constituents, she's representing a point of view, and I think that she should be in there. I do think there are systemic problems with our electoral system. But I don't think it's because believe me, there were crazy people when my uncle was in there. The really crazy, openly racist, hateful people who were, terrible, terrible people. So this is not new. This was happening my whole life. There were really strange people in Congress. And the thing that's changed is in 2010, when the corporations took over Congress because of the Citizens United case. And we had there had been a time before in American history when Congress was taken over and the government was taken over by wealthy individuals and by oligarchs. And that was in what we call the Gilded Age, and there was no direct election of senators. The senators were chosen by the legislatures. The legislatures were owned by the robber barons. It was said about the Pennsylvania state legislature that none of them were for sale. It was the only legislature in the country where everybody wasn't for sale. And that was because John D. Rockefeller owned them all and he wouldn't sell any of them. And so they were all corrupt. And the presidents, the senators, everybody was chosen by this group of the Whitneys, the Morgans, the Carnegies, the Fricks, et cetera. And we almost lost democracy at that time. And then you had this confluence of interesting things happen. You had muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair writing for McClure's, which everybody in the country read, that was doing exposés on the robber barons. You had a populist democratic movement begin in the countryside to reform agriculture and to keep it out of the hands of the banks. And in the cities, you had the reformers who were moderate Republicans, who were also trying to overthrow the system, and they united. And you had this very dynamic, extraordinary president who came from the oligarchy, but then turned on him, Teddy Roosevelt. And they passed, the first time they passed an income tax in this country so that the rich had to pay, some of their share. They passed a corporate income tax, graduated income tax. They passed the 40-hour work week. They gave women the vote. They banned child labor. And they allowed unions to organize for the first time legally. And they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up, and they began breaking up the big trusts. They broke up the Standard Oil. But the most important law they passed was in 1908, they passed a law that banned corporate contributions to federal political candidates. And for 100 years, that protected American democracy. And then in 2010, a business-friendly Supreme Court threw that out. They said political contributions are free speech, protected by the First Amendment. No other nation in the world has that. And they unleashed this tsunami of billions and billions of dollars of corporate cash into our electoral process. Now to run for Senate in New York, U.S. Senate, costs you $100 million. And that means you have to make 2,000 phone calls, in the year, every year, and you're making phone calls all day. There's an office, right? You're not allowed to make campaign calls from Congress, but they now have a building next to Congress where they all run over and they spend their days dialing for dollars. And they don't want any contribution under 10 grand. And those are the only people they talk to. So if you didn't give your 10 grand, they only have so many hours during the year. And what that buys, that 10 grand contribution, is that, you have to meet with that guy when he wants to meet with you. And you don't have time to meet with anybody else. If you didn't give your 10 grand to congressman minimum, you have no voice in the American political process anymore. And that's the problem. And, they're all owned.
Last question.
Well, is it Bobby or Mr. President or just Mr. Kennedy? I've noticed that there are a lot of behaviors and decisions that are made here in America that have a negative connotation, a lot of times in our own country, but also internationally. And I've concluded for myself that I think Americans have forgotten who they are. And I'm talking about the virtues. So if you could speak to, please describe what you see an American is. Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree with you that I was shocked during COVID that, when it was revealed, particularly after the Twitter files, that the government was censoring political opponents, and that involving the federal agencies, the FBI, the CIA, which they gave a portal, and that White House officials were calling up Facebook and emailing them, which we have their emails, saying, we're going to pull your Section 230 immunity and destroy your company if you don't censor our political opponents. and that Americans didn't rise up and say, hey, that's not kosher. And yet we didn't. And we put up with, they knew. Hamilton, Madison, Adams said that we put freedom of expression in the First Amendment because all the other rights are dependent on it. If a nation has the power to silence its opponents, it has license for every atrocity. And as soon as they got permission to thwart the First Amendment, they went after freedom of religion. They closed every church in the country for a year with no scientific citation, no due process, no public hearing, no notice and comment rulemaking, no environmental impact statement. They then went after freedom of assembly with these bizarre laws that Fauci last week admitted were taken out of thin air, social distancing, no scientific citation. They went after property rights. They closed 3.3 million businesses without any due process, no just compensation, in violation of the Fifth Amendment. They ended jury trials in violation of the Seventh Amendment. And for any company that did any countermeasure, no matter how negligent or reckless they were, no matter how grievous your injury, you can't sue them. And they got rid of the Fourth Amendment prohibitions against warrantless searches and seizures with these track and trace surveillance. And I can go on. They basically threw out the whole Constitution, and we put up with it. And, part of my presidency will be reminding the American public about, what we lost. After when we close, which I think is right now, I'm going to do a selfie line and take my picture with anybody here who wants to get one. So if you line up on this side, and I'll take a picture.
Mr. Kennedy, we appreciate your responses. We appreciate all that you had to share today. One of the most burning questions that I'm going to ask you, it's only going to be a 30-second answer. The survey says from people who are, this comes from when they asked, what's the number one question to ask Robert F. Kennedy Jr. from men who are 70 to 73 years old and women who are 65 to 75 years old. When they went, survey says, the number one, how do you stay so fit?
I pay attention to it. I do intermittent fasting, and I don't eat usually before noon, and then I try to quit at 7, and then I hike every day about 3 miles. And then I go to the gym. I don't only stay for 30 minutes because that makes it sustainable for me.
Yeah.
But anyway,
That's
thank
beautiful.
you.
Everybody, if you have a goal.